All right, everybody, buckle up, because today we are going deep, and I mean deep, into the world of India's self-proclaimed godmen.
Ooh, should be interesting.
You guys have sent in some wild stuff, videos, articles, you name it. And let me tell you, these babas, they do not hold back.
No kidding. I've seen some of the headlines.
We're talking healing rituals,
Yeah.
people claiming they can reverse aging.
Reverse age, like Benjamin Button stuff.
Yeah, like literally turning 70 years old into 17. It's nuts.
Oh,
And there's even one guy who claims his whole deal is eradicating blind faith.
that's a bit ironic, isn't it?
And
Considering.
you see it, right.
Hmm.
But we'll get into that.
So how do we even begin to unpack all this?
Well, first off, it's important to know this isn't exactly brand new.
Right. India's got a long history with gurus and spirituality.
Exactly. This isn't some new fad. It goes back centuries.
Centuries is right. What's different now, I think, is the scale. These guys aren't just operating in some ashram in the mountains anymore.
You're telling me some of these figures, they have followings larger than entire countries.
And don't even get me started on the money involved. We're talking serious wealth.
Oh, yeah. One of the videos mentioned trusts worth hundreds of crores. And for anyone who doesn't know, 1 crore. That's 10 million rupees. So we're talking serious, serious cash.
It's mind-boggling, but it speaks to the level of devotion these babas inspire. People give everything to them.
And I mean everything. One of the articles you sent, it talked about this tragic stampede in Hathras. 123 people died just trying to get this Baba's blessing.
Oh, I remember reading about that. Just awful.
And what gets me is that the followers, they blame themselves. They didn't blame the lack of crowd control. They didn't blame the Baba himself.
It's like their faith overrides everything else. Logic, safety, all of it goes out the window.
That's exactly it. So then the question becomes, what creates that level of, I don't even know what to call it, unwavering belief?
Well, I think you have to look at who these figures are targeting. There are two main groups that come to mind. The first, and it's usually the smaller group, are the truly desperate. People who feel like they've exhausted all other options.
So we're talking people with debilitating illnesses, people who can't afford basic necessities, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Imagine you're facing something like infertility, you've tried everything, spent all your money, and nothing's worked. Then along comes this charismatic figure who promises you a miracle.
It's almost like at that point, hope itself becomes its own kind of logic, you know? You're so desperate for a solution, any solution, that you're willing to suspend disbelief.
Precisely. And that's where these babas, they really thrive, in that space of vulnerability and desperation.
But it's not just about those who are most vulnerable, right? I mean, the sources also talked about a second, much larger group of followers. And this is where it gets really interesting, because we're talking about people who, on the surface, might seem to have it all.
Right. But often they're coming from a place of social conditioning, especially the women who make up a large part of these followings.
And that's something we see across cultures, not just in India. The pressure to conform, to fit into these predefined roles.
Absolutely. And if you're raised in an environment where your voice is silenced, where questioning authority figures is taboo.
You're basically primed to accept what you're told without question.
Exactly. And in many cultures, men are seen as those authority figures, those protectors and problem solvers. So the babas, they just slot right into that pre-existing role.
It's like they're filling a void that's already there, a need for someone to tell them what to do, how to live their lives.
Exactly. They provide that certainty, that sense of belonging that many people crave. And let's not forget, this isn't just about individual families or communities. This kind of power dynamic, it often reflects what's happening in broader society as well.
You're right. And one of the sources, it mentioned this unspoken class difference that exists within families, where the man of the house, the breadwinner, often holds this unquestioned authority, even if, logically, someone might disagree with him.
It's just not done to question him.
Exactly. And that kind of dynamic, it can make people, especially women, even more susceptible to these charismatic figures who come in and claim to have all the answers.
Especially in a place like India, where historically there's this deep emphasis on respecting elders and authority figures.
Which, to be clear, respect for elders, that's important.
Of course, it's crucial. But it becomes a problem when that respect morphs into blind acceptance, when you're no longer allowed to question or think critically. And that's what makes this whole thing so tricky. Because on the one hand, you have these deep-seated cultural norms that encourage respect for authority.
Which, again, isn't inherently a bad thing.
Right. But then you layer on top of that this almost magnetic pull that these babas have. And it's not just societal pressure anymore, it's something deeper. It's like they tap into something primal, this deep-seated need we all have for meaning, for answers, for someone to show us the way.
And when those answers aren't readily available, or when life throws you a curveball.
Our brains, they're hardwired to seek out those answers, even if they come from unconventional sources, and that's where the psychology of belief comes into play.
Okay, so we're talking about things like the placebo effect, where just believing something will work can actually make it work.
Exactly. You give someone a sugar pill, tell them it's a miracle cure.
And suddenly their symptoms disappear.
Sometimes. Because their belief, that conviction, it triggers a real physiological response in their body. Now, apply that same principle to those staged miracle cures we see with these babas. The music, the chanting, the sheer fervor of the crowd, it creates this atmosphere where anything feels possible.
Especially when you factor in the fear and lack of education that some of the sources mention.
Absolutely. If you're told your illness is a curse, or that only this baba can save you,
You're going to be more likely to believe anything they tell you.
it's like they prey on those vulnerabilities, those deep-seated anxieties, which, it's interesting because I was reading through the comments on some of those YouTube videos you sent.
Oh yeah, people did not hold back.
Some were really harsh, calling these followers gullible, brainwashed, even stupid. And look, I get it. It can be hard to understand how anyone could fall for this stuff, but I think it's more complicated than that.
You're saying it's not just about being gullible or naive.
Right. I think it boils down to this. Belief often stems from need. When our basic needs are need for security, belonging, a sense of purpose.
Those fundamental things that make us human.
Exactly. When those needs aren't being met, we become much more susceptible to someone who promises to fulfill them, even if those solutions are based more on faith than on fact. It's like that old saying, a drowning man will clutch at straws.
So even if it seems illogical, even if it defies all reason, if it offers a glimmer of hope, a way out of that despair.
People will grasp onto it. And let's be fair, some of these babas, they do provide tangible help, at least on the surface.
Yeah, one article mentioned a godman who'd built hospitals and schools using donations from followers. He's providing education, healthcare.
Essentially filling a void left by inadequate social support systems. But, and this is a big but good deeds, they don't give someone a free pass. Because once that power dynamic is established, once people surrender their critical thinking to that authority figure.
It's a slippery slope.
Exactly. And that's where things can take a very dark turn. Because it's not always about miracle cures and charitable acts.
No, the sources were full of stories about things going bad.
Yeah.
We're talking sexual assault allegations, financial fraud.
Even people dying because they were told to forego conventional medical treatment in favor of the Baba's blessings.
It's terrifying. But how do they get away with it? That's what gets me.
Power. It always comes back to power. And it's not just spiritual power, it's often political power, too.
Right. Like that God-man with his own private army who attacked the police. That's not about faith. That's about raw power.
These figures, they cultivate connections with powerful people, politicians, celebrities, wealthy donors. It gives them this aura of invincibility, this protection from scrutiny.
It's like they're above the law. And when you have that kind of power, that level of influence.
People become afraid to speak out. They're afraid of the consequences. And the followers who do start to question things, they're often ostracized, silenced, pushed out of the group. It creates this culture of fear and self-censorship.
It's a vicious cycle. But here's the thing that really gets me. It's not just poor and uneducated who are drawn in. We're talking celebrities, wealthy businessmen, even Nobel laureates becoming followers of these figures.
It's true. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating and so unnerving, because it suggests that this susceptibility to manipulation, this yearning for something to believe in.
It's a universal human trait. It's like we all have that potential,
Yeah.
to be swept up in something bigger than ourselves, even if it might not be entirely rational.
Oh, absolutely. We see it all the time. And not just with these godmen. Think about sports fans, for example.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
People devote their entire lives to following a team, a player. They spend their hard-earned money on jerseys, tickets, travel. They get into heated arguments, even lose friendships over it.
And don't even get started on those diehard fans who paint their faces and wear those crazy costumes to the games.
Exactly. It's about passion, about belonging, about feeling like you're part of something larger than yourself. And those needs, those desires, they're not inherently bad. In fact, they're part of what makes us human. but when those needs aren't being met in healthy ways.
We become vulnerable to those who promise to fulfill them, even if it means bending the truth a little or a lot.
Exactly. And suddenly those red flags, those warning signs, we don't see them so clearly anymore.
So what can we do if this kind of thing can happen to anyone? How do we protect ourselves? How do we teach ourselves to recognize those red flags, even when we're caught up in the moment?
Well, I think it starts with cultivating critical thinking skills. Don't just take everything at face value, question things.
Even if the person saying them seems trustworthy or has a huge following.
Especially then. Look for evidence to support their claims. Be wary of anyone who discourages you from seeking outside opinions or who demands unquestioning obedience.
It's like that old saying, if it sounds too good to be true.
It probably is.
Exactly.
But
But even knowing that, it's easy to get caught up in the moment. So what else can we do? How do we strengthen those critical thinking muscles so that we're less likely to fall prey to this kind of manipulation?
read widely from a variety of sources. Talk to people who hold different viewpoints. And most importantly, trust your gut.
That's huge. If something feels off, even if you can't quite put your finger on it.
Pay attention to that feeling. Don't be afraid to walk away from a situation that makes you uncomfortable, even if everyone else seems to be on board.
That takes courage. But it's so important because ultimately you're responsible for your own well-being, your own choices. And as we've seen today, the consequences of not trusting your gut can be devastating. Well, this has been a wild ride. We've gone from miracle cures to mass manipulation, from the psychology of belief to the dangers of blind faith. It's a lot to process.
It really is. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's this: question everything, trust yourself, and never underestimate the power of critical thinking.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this fascinating and at times unsettling world of Godmen and blind faith.
My pleasure. It's been an enlightening conversation.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, stay curious, stay critical, and as always, thanks for listening.